Kia ora koutou, and welcome to today's webinar on climate change impacts in the primary sector. Ko Caitlin Carew toka wingua. I'm the Senior Communications Advisor for the Resilience to Nature's Challenges National Science Challenge. That's quite a mouthful, our name. Along with our Land and Water National Science Challenge, we are supporting the Adapting Aotearoa Symposium and Webinar Series. And the Deep South Challenge is, of course, leading this kaupapa. The symposium and webinars are focusing on climate adaptation in our food and farming sectors. And today's session specifically focuses on the climate change impacts in our primary sector. So this week's webinar and next week's webinar are lead-in events to the Adapting Aotearoa Symposium, which is being held in Ōtautahi Christchurch on Monday, the 20th of November. So please do check that out if you are not already signed up. Like I said, today's webinar focuses on impacts, and then next week on Monday, the 13th of November, again, 12 till 1, we are running a webinar on barriers and enablers to adaptation. So do come along to that one. Today's session is being recorded, so if you have colleagues that cannot make it today, we'll be sending out the recording later this week, so please do pass that on to them. I'm going to lead us off with a karakia, and then I'll go through some housekeeping, and I will introduce our facilitator, Dr. Nick Craddock-Henry of GNS Science, and he will be introducing today's wonderful panel. Whakataka te hau ki te uru. Whakatake te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atakura, he te o, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. So in terms of housekeeping, we will be running the Q&A at the end of our three speakers. Our three speakers will be speaking for 10 minutes each, and then we'll move straight into Q&A. So if you have questions, please pop them in the Q&A function as you think of them, so that we will have some to kick off with when we move to Q&A at about 12:40. So I will introduce Dr. Nick Craddock-Henry from GNS Science, who is involved in the Adapting Aotearoa Symposium, and will be able to provide us with some background and some context to today's discussions, and he will introduce our speakers. Kia ora, Nick, over to you.
Kia ora, Caitlin. Thanks very much for that. Ko Nick Craddock-Henry, toko ingoa. My name is Nick Craddock-Henry. I'm Principal Scientist with GNS Science. Last month, the Ministry for the Environment and Stats NZ released another fairly landmark report detailing the changes in our atmosphere and climate. In the previous, the report covered a period of 3 years since the last report in 2020. And the conclusion of that report was essentially climate change is here and it's now. And this shouldn't come as a surprise. There has been evidence for some time now that climate change is making a difference to New Zealand now. That was from a paper by Luke Harrington and colleagues back in nearly 10 years ago when they looked at the data from the 2012-2013 drought. And the report makes it very clear, for example, this headline from the newspaper in the following days, that extreme rainfall is already worse in nearly half of all New Zealand towns. And these, of course, has significant impacts and implications for rural communities. There was, in addition to this the extreme rainfall, there was an article in the paper just a couple of days ago outlining the additional stress of pending El Nino year that was going to take, the toll that was going to take on farmers. And we see, again, in the research that the sort of unprecedented conditions, so again, looking at the 2017-18 drought, is providing us with a useful analog for the sorts of conditions that we might expect mid and later in the century. So the essential sort of message, I suppose, is that, yes, climate change is here and it's now, but there is something that we can do about it. And I think that that's important to recognize, that not only in addition to sort of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating climate change, there is a certain element of climate change that's already sort of baked into the system, and that we do actually have agency and we can adapt to these impacts. And so this series of webinars really does bring together the three national science challenges: Deep South, Our Land and Water, and Resilience to Nature's Challenges, which each of these different challenges have contributed to and are contributing to different aspects of research looking at this adaptation question. And so we do need adaptation knowledge. And a few years ago, we developed this sort of framework that really kind of outlined that, yes, adaptation is kind of is quite holistic. And so we do need to understand about not only the direct impacts of climate change. So what are the impacts of increasing temperature, of declining rainfall, of higher winds? How do those impacts directly influence and impact productive agricultural systems as well as urban systems? What are the implications of those for management and practice? And then how do decisions get made, and who makes those decisions, and what influences them? And then how do we actually close the gap between theory and practice? And so this series of webinars, the first one today, really focuses around those impacts and implications. So what are the direct impacts of climate change on productive agricultural systems, and how do those in turn influence and shape management practices? And then next week, we'll look in a bit more detail at the sort of decisions and actions. So who takes decisions? How are those decisions influenced by the different context of adaptation? And how can we close that gap between theory and practice? So our first presenter this morning is Pierre Bukes, and Pierre will also be participating in this symposium, which is coming up on the 20th. And if you haven't registered for that already, we would definitely encourage you to do so. We'll put a link in the chat for that. Pierre is the team leader for farm systems modeling at Dairy New Zealand in Hamilton. And Pierre's project is part of the primary sector preparedness, which is a project funded through the Deep South Science Challenge, which is looking at the impacts of climate change for the dairy industry across a wide range of issues, right through from impacts through to implications and understanding adaptation and pathways. So I'll pass over to Pierre.
Thank you, Nick. Let me just get my slides up. Is that good to go?
Yeah.
Good. Good day, everyone. Thanks very much for this opportunity. As Nick has mentioned, this piece of work falls under the National Science Challenge Deep South, Primary Sector Preparedness to Climate Change, a collaborative effort between Lincoln University, Agribusiness and Economics Research Unit, Dairy NZ, Manake Whenua Landcare, and NIWA. But my piece is really just focused on climate change impacts in the dairy sector. And thanks to my colleagues here at Dairy NZ, Andrea Babylon, Taisekwa Shikaze, and Ryan Mills. So we looked at the dairy sector in two mega regions, the Upper North Island, UNI for the next slides, and the Lower South Island. The two maps there, Upper UNI on the right-hand side top and LSI on the right-hand side bottom there, with the aims of understanding climate change and the effect of that on pasture performance and how that flows through to farm-scale economic impacts, options for adaptations, with the ultimate goal to come up with decision support for farmers to cope with climate change. We zoomed in on specific districts. The red arrow there, PM, Piako Matamata, or Matamata Piako, whichever way you want to say that around, and then the Edendale district in the Lower South Island. So I will be speaking briefly on 4 topics, the ryegrass persistence, for which we only looked at the Upper North Island because it's a crucial aspect of dairying in this part of the world. Pasture yield and growth rates, farm scales, impact and adaptation, and then the last slide on farmer decision support and the outputs we've come up so far with. Pasture persistence, Dr. Andrea Babylon, she worked on this. She used a model called the basic grass model, or in short, BASGRA model, European inherited model, modified for New Zealand, validated across 3 sites. It is a mechanistic physiology model of a ryegrass plant, but not only models growth, daily growth, but also population dynamics, which gives us basal cover, which is a key metric for pasture persistence, how long a ryegrass pasture persists and produces acceptable yields. It requires daily climate data, which we receive from NIWA, historic and into the future for the rest of this century. And Andrea worked in the Upper North Island, and you see the 14 dairy-dominant districts there, with Piako Matamata, the pink one, as one of those. So in short, the output, which were graphs, you see the 3 graphs there. Left is mid-century. In the middle there is second half of the century, and on the right is the end century. I want you, first, the color coding means a high ryegrass persistence is 3.5 to 6 years. That's green. Yellow is a medium, 2.5 to 3.5 years persistence, and then red is low persistence, less than 2.5 years. I want you to keep your eyes on the big yellow blob at the bottom of that graph, which is the Waikato mega region, which is a key dairy region in the Upper North Island. Currently, the ryegrass persistence sits between yellow and green, so medium to high, with a little bit of red here and there. And as you go from left to right, you can see in that big yellow blob how the red starts to increase. And it's really a lot of red towards the end of century. So what are we saying is that ryegrass persistence is going to come under pressure in the Upper North Island in several regions, especially a key region like the Waikato. What about pasture yield? And here we have the two graphs there, the LSI, Edendale district on the left, and the UNI, the Matamata Piako district on the right. This is relative, so 100% is the current, the horizontal red line. And you see 2 colored lines there as warming pathways, or RCPs. The red is 4.5 and blue is RCP 8.5. But generally speaking, if you look at that left graph, into the future, the yield, tons of dry matter per hectare from a ryegrass pasture, is going to maybe increase a bit towards mid-century, but generally very little change and not much lower than currently, either increase or about the same. Whereas the right-hand graph is quite a different story for the Matamata Piako, where there's going to be a sharp decrease of about 35%, we predict, by the mid-century, and then even further down to end century by 45%. But as you know, that ryegrass, the yield, tons of dry matter per hectare, is important, but not actually that important to farmers. It's more how the pasture grows through the year. And this is 4 graphs from the Edendale district. This is kilos of dry matter per hectare per day, monthly growth rates. First, I want to, before I get to the 4 graphs, there's a black line. And the black line is the feed demand from a typical Edendale farm. That's the demand for feed from the cows. And that line is the same across all 4 graphs. And that has been determined using a typical farm. And then the top 2 graphs would be mid-century, and the bottom 2 would be end century. And then on the left 2 would be the green ones, would be an optimistic. As you can imagine, we don't only have one grass growth curve. We've got a whole population with all the climate predictions we got from NIWA and our own models, sensitivities, etc. We pick the middle line as our optimistic, and then 1 standard deviation below as less optimistic. But what you can see in 3 of those graphs, the top 2 and the bottom left one, is that there's times when supply, the green and the colored lines, that's growth, supply, exceeds demand, and there's times when it is less than demand. So there's times of surplus and times of deficits. And what we say is that in most situations in the lower South Island, Edendale district, by doing what farmers are currently doing, by shifting feed from times of surplus to times of deficit, by shifting culling and dry-off dates slightly, bringing in a bit more supplement feed from outside the farm, they should get by. That should be sufficient adaptation for lower South Island farms. Mainly, the only graph is down bottom right, which is end century less optimistic. We can see there's virtually no surpluses, mainly deficits, especially in the summertime. That's when farmers may have to do something different than tactical management, maybe a summer crop, a turnip crop, to pull them through there. So in general, lower South Island farmers should be fine by using their tactical management decisions they're currently using. That's the red line there, arrow of moving feed from time of surplus to a time of deficit. How does that translate into profitability, dollars? This is now, if farmers do nothing, that's impacts. And you've got this little table there, mid-century, end century, the 2 columns, optimistic, middle of the road, less optimistic, a bad outlook. And you can see positives on operating profit compared to current. So this is relative to current. Plus 26, plus 7, a small deficit in operating or a hit in operating profit, a less optimistic mid-century, minus 12 is also not that bad. So what we're saying is that the farmers are not going to be hit hard, we say, using the projections into the future by climate change when we look at these numbers. And when they implement those tactical, well-known management that they are currently doing, maybe adding a summer crop when they think when they have a less optimistic outlook, they can add a 3% to these numbers. So basically the -2 will be wiped out, and the hit of -12 will become a -9 in terms of operating profit. What is the situation in Matamata Piako? Very different. Same situation, 3 graphs there. The red line now is the feed demand from a typical Matamata Piako farm now. And that's the current. And that red line stays the same through all 3 graphs there. And the blue line is the feed supply, is the growth rate. And you can see that green shaded area, that's the deficit in the summers. And farmers from that district tells us we know all about that already. You don't have to tell us about that. Well, what we're telling them is that deficit is going to get bigger when we look at mid-century, and when we look at end century, it's going to get deeper and longer. Start earlier, finish later. And that needs adaptation. You cannot live with that without adapting or simply coping with the impacts of that. And what does the impacts look like in terms of operating profit? Same table, mid-century, end century, 2 columns, optimistic is goodish, less optimistic, a bad year. And you can see there, only mid-century optimistic, there's a positive in the operating profit if you do nothing. This is all impact only, do nothing. But the impact on operating profit can be large, from a -25 to a -65%. So this is where we approach farmers. We had several workshops. We got the input from them, and they gave us what would they do when we showed them those graphs of deficits. This is what they will do. Summer crops, there's a whole list of them. They would look at their calving and culling dates to avoid the dry summers. Even go autumn calving. They will look at more drought-resistant pastures, tall fescues and cocksfoots, etc. We bumped into a very nice farmer who shared a lot of nice info. I don't have time to go into that. But what we did is we modeled some of that. And those red numbers in the same table, mid-century, end century, those are from the previous slide. That's the hit on operating profit. And the green numbers would be relative to that hit, that impact, or doing nothing. You don't really have to adapt for mid-century optimistic, but if you want to use a drought-resistant pasture, tall fescue, you can add a 3% to that. If you use a tall fescue and century optimistic, you can basically cancel out the negative impact with that 26 plus. Tall fescue, less optimistic, mid-century, you can do a big change in that minus 33 with a 20%. Chicory, only a small positive there of 4%. And then tall fescue and autumn carving can give you a 24% plus, but it still leaves you with a hit of a 40% in operating profit. And I can't see my numbers there because, Nick, your little picture is in the way, but there's a 14%, which I think is turnips and autumn carving, but you'll still be left with a 50% hit. So that is what we think is going to happen in Matamata Piako. And I want to go forward to my last slide, and it doesn't want to go. If I go here down, doesn't want to change. For some reason, Nick, I don't get my slide to change. I hit the down button. Do I hit another key? No. I wanted to show my key messages, which is my last slide. Any advice? What I can? Oh, there. Okay. Let's just try my take-home messages on and current slide. Can you see that one? Key takeaways? Yep. Okay. Great. Last slide. What we're saying in a nutshell, ryegrass persistence is projected to decrease substantially in the Upper North Island. Yields in the Lower South Island, same or higher, which then reflects in profitability, largely positive, except maybe end century if you have a less optimistic outlook. Generally speaking, Lower South Island, you can get away with tactical adaptations, shifting feed, slight shifts in dry off and culling dates, but generally not major strategic changes in the farm system. Very different story in the Upper North Island. Large summer feed deficits, going to get much larger. Big hit in operating profits of 25 to 60% if you do nothing. Alternative pastures, more resilient, drought-resistant pastures. Summer crops can help, but will not wipe out all of those negatives. And I'm not going to go into this. A few products, few outputs, flyers to farmers, presentations, published papers in press that we have as part of our decision support. That's me. Thank you. Hope it wasn't too long, too much over the 10 minutes. Thanks, Nick.
No, that was brilliant. Thanks very much, Pierre. So that's been a really good introduction to the types of impacts that we can expect for sort of dairy farm systems in both the sort of upper island and the South Island. Our second presenter is Catherine McRae, senior scientist with Ag Research, and Catherine's work is one of two projects within Whitiora, which is the Land Use Opportunities program within our Land and Water, one of which we'll put in the chat around horticultural disease. But Catherine's is looking at predicting disease for sheep farmers in a changing New Zealand climate. Catherine, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nick. So today I'm presenting some work that was done mainly by my colleagues at Ag Research, and I'll acknowledge who did what at the end. But today I'm going to be talking about predicting disease risks for sheep farmers in a changing New Zealand climate. So climatic variability in New Zealand means that our animal health challenges aren't evenly distributed. We have warm, moist conditions in the north compared to the south, and that favours a couple of diseases in particular. The first being facial eczema, which is a disease of ruminants. It's a metabolic disease which results when animals ingest the spores from a fungus, Pseudopitheamyces chatarum, which is toxic. And that clinical symptoms from that include photosensitivity, as you can see in this picture of the sheep, and that's where the disease gets its name. but it does result in decreased production and reproduction, particularly in sheep. In 2009, as you can see in this map here, Diamena et al. Predicted that under 3 degrees of climate warming, the areas that were affected by facial eczema, shown in the black, would increase markedly. Secondly, we have Homunculus contortus, or Barber's poleworm, which is a gastrointestinal parasite, so an internal parasite, primarily in sheep. It's a bloodsucker and results in anemia and death. So to note is that the animal has a life cycle on pasture, so the eggs are deposited in the feces and then the eggs grow into larvae, which crawl up the grass and then are ingested by the sheep. So there is an outside proportion of their life cycle. That also occurs with greater frequency and intensity in North Island. So as part of this work, our question was, what is the risk for these diseases under projected climate change? Firstly, we looked at facial eczema. So this work is being published in the Grasslands Journal and should be available soon. But that involved developing a simple model for climate suitability for sporulation of the fungus using both temperature and rainfall index. So we used national spore counts as well as expert knowledge to evaluate the model that was developed, and that was from 2008 to 2021. We found that the suitability estimates did have a significant correlation with spore counts, and as you can see on here, we've shown some of the most suitable years of those 14 that were looked at, including 2016, and the lighter areas on the map are where the suitability is higher for facial eczema. This was also consistent with documented outbreaks. So once we'd developed the model, our next question was, how does that look under future emissions scenarios? We chose 2 key emissions scenarios to present here. One very optimistic of RCP 2.6 and one pessimistic, which is the RCP 8.5. I've shown here the results for both 2040 and 2080 under those 2 scenarios. And as you can see, at a national level, the average suitability for the fungus is predicted to increase under both of those scenarios, with the magnitude of increase greater under 8.5. So under both scenarios, the suitability was predicted to markedly increase between 2021 and 2030. Under RCP 2.6, the suitability fluctuated around a roughly constant mean from 2030 through to 2120, whereas with under RCP 8.5, it continued to increase until about 2080 before stabilising. And if we look at the overall mean suitability across all locations, you can see that in this graph. So the historical suitability is bouncing around lower on the graph, and then under our different scenarios, they're reasonably similar up until about 2060, when the RCP 8.5, starts to separate or diverge from 2.6. There is more detail in the paper, but it got broken down by region as well. And as you can see, these are just 3 selected ones, including the Waikato, Otago, and the Manawatu, that depending on the year, it depends on which of the scenarios the suitability can actually be quite similar between the 2 scenarios, but it does tend to diverge looking into the future. So like I said, that information is all in our paper, which will be published soon. Following on from that, our question was, what does this look like for Homunculus contortus, so for this blood-sucking parasite? So this work used a model from Dave Lethwick's 2013 paper, and it's a temperature-driven model, which uses maximum and minimum temperatures, and the assumption is that moisture is not limiting. So it looks at development and survival rates, so from those eggs through to infective larvae. And what Christian did was he looked at risk for past and future climate scenarios, similar to what we did with facial eczema. Using a spatial resolution of 0.05 degrees, they used a cumulative model for September to November as a proxy for that spring increase in parasite numbers. So spring was chosen because we know that while the actual parasite itself tends to be more of a problem over summer months, the build-up in the spring is what is driving that outbreak. So the results for 1981 to 2000 were related to expert knowledge to establish risk. in this map here. Yellow is occasional outbreaks, orange is regular outbreaks, and red is high probability of outbreaks. And in the red area, there's a likelihood as well that the region will probably get homunculus in the winter months as well. Last year, for example, in Gisborne, they saw homunculus all year round. So we're wanting to know, how does risk change in the future? Once again, selected some results to show you here under 2 emission scenarios, under 2.5 and 8.5. While 2.5 might be overly optimistic, I chose these to compare them to the facial eczema results. So what we see is an increase in the risk in the lower North Island and in parts of the west and the east coast of the South Island as well. And as you can see, under the worst case scenario in the North Island, almost all areas will have a high risk of this parasite, potentially year round. One thing that's interesting is comparing both of these risk maps back to that of Dimena et al. And as you can see, while there are some differences, they are remarkably similar. So our risk of disease in the North Island is extending, and it's creeping down into the South Island as well. And I have to say that this is something that didn't necessarily surprise any of the researchers involved in this work, but it is nice to actually have this modelled. We know that for both of these diseases, we are seeing them creeping down towards the South Island, and that the season is extending as well. So to summarise this work, it's given us insight into changes in disease risk for our farmers under the predicted future climate data. Unsurprisingly, it's shown that climatic suitability for both are going to increase with time in many regions, particularly in the southern North Island and eastern South Island, but it could actually remain relatively static in some other areas. One thing to note is that we're unsure how extreme weather events are going to impact disease risk. So if, for example, there is flooding and that's going to reduce grazing area for these animals, which mean that there will be increased nutritional stress and they will be grazing lower on the pasture, and that's probably going to increase disease risk as well, but that is more difficult to model. At the moment, both of these diseases can be managed using available tools, zinc for facial eczema and drenches or anthelmintics for parasites, but this is likely to change in the future. There's anthelmintic resistance to many species of parasites, and it's getting worse, and there are potentially issues around using zinc in animals to the future. So the additional thing from this work has shown that disease is going to be maybe present in areas not currently affected. This is, like I mentioned, it's already starting to be seen, and it highlights the need for a real-time forecasting tool, particularly for farmers who aren't aware of these diseases or aren't as aware and aren't as used to being able to use preventative measures. So both studies also highlighted the need for accurate data to be recorded for future models, including for the facial eczema work, exact location of the collection data, and in terms of the parasite work, impact of moisture on larval development. I'd just like to acknowledge the people that actually did most of the work. This was funded by the Whitiwhiti Ora program under Our Land and Water and the Deep South National Science Challenge. The facial eczema work was led by Craig Phillips and Tricia Johnson, with Federico and myself and Tony providing support, and the homunculus work was led by Christian Salmon. And with that, that is it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. That was fascinating, and we're just reflecting on Pierre's talk and the ways in which the North Island really is sort of particularly for both eczema and impacts for dairy in terms of feed supply will be severely affected. And interestingly, as we sort of move into our next presenter, that sort of difficulty around not only sort of modeling extreme weather events and the probabilities of extreme weathers, but also how those extreme weather events may have additional implications for not only pastoral systems, but horticulture as well. And so our third presenter this morning is Dr. Heather Craig, who comes to us from the University of Canterbury, previously from NIWA. And Heather is going to be, Heather is also part of the primary sector preparedness program, part of the Deep South. And she's going to be speaking to us about dairy farm exposure and impacts from coastal flooding and sea level rise. Heather.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou, everyone. Ko he te Craig tōku ingoa, he te whariwānanga o Waitaha Aoi Pukenga. So my name is Heather Craig. I'm a lecturer at the University of Canterbury. This is a piece of work, though, that I actually mostly did at NIWA. I only recently started a new job. So, yeah, shout out to my NIWA colleagues, especially Alec and Ryan, who contributed quite a bit to this work. So, yeah, so, oh, no, I'm having a PA. Mine didn't move. Oh, it did. Great. So yes, this is a piece of work that we did looking basically at the exposure of dairy farms in New Zealand to coastal inundation from extreme sea level events, and also with the added influence of relative sea level rise. So we're starting to increasingly see pictures like this and headlines like this where productive land in New Zealand is being affected by this coastal inundation, which brings with it a whole host of challenges that can be quite complex and different to those that we would have experienced from fluvial and pluvial flooding that we might be more familiar with. So the aim of this study was to consider a few different scenarios in terms of the severity and frequency of the extreme event, and then also look at relative sea level rise increments of 0.5 metres up to 2 metres. So we didn't tie these to any particular RCP level. What we did was we just looked at that relative change. Yeah. So we wanted to look at both the exposure level, but also think about what we would expect the impact severity to be on a property as a whole. And also, then I guess the next stage is to think a little bit more about what that might mean for the recovery needs of farmers. So we all know dairy farming is really important. I'm sure Pierre would agree. But not only is it important for the things that we traditionally would think of it as being important for, you know, our economy, our exports, who doesn't love cheese, but also there is this huge indirect importance to the dairy industry in New Zealand, where it's not only our economic well-being, but in a lot of places it's our social well-being. We have whole agricultural service towns. So yeah, so it's a really highly exposed and vulnerable industry, but one that is vitally important to our future. Current sea levels, 100-year event. Ryan Paulick did some work as part of, I think it was the Deep South Challenge work actually, where he said that you know, even at current sea levels, we would expect these extreme events to potentially expose about 1,500 kilometres squared of productive land in New Zealand. So we already know we're highly exposed. But the thing that kind of kicked this project off was the creation of these coastal flood maps. So we now have a national suite of flood maps that take into account both the current mean sea level, but also the storm, tide and wave setup components that make up our extreme sea level events. So yeah, so you can all look up the paper. It's really cool. Yeah, it's given us these static inundation maps where we really can test things like this, you know, more thoroughly. So to do this, we created a dairy production layer using primarily agri-based data to identify our dairy farms. We also wanted to identify what we thought could be the most productive land within each farm. So for this, we used the Manaaki Whenua land use capability layer. And then the next challenge was identifying the dairy sheds, which, yeah, was so much fun. The LINS building footprints data set, which is amazing for identifying, it's particularly amazing in an urban setting, but less so maybe in a rural setting. So we had to do a bit of processing to identify our dairy sheds and milking pads. And then we used QV data to give us an idea of what the value of these exposed assets might be. So to do this impact assessment work, we used Riskscape. Riskscape it's a modular software for evaluating impact or risk. It's open source for research use. It is currently, you operate it through a command line interface, but there are plans to work towards a bit more of a user interface, I guess, in various forms. Yeah. So it's a really powerful tool that you can use, you know, in all different combinations and configurations to create some really interesting data. So you can do your, basic hazard exposure where you just have a single hazard and you geospatially sample your exposed assets, and you can rapidly come up with data about those. You can also look probabilistically by using multiple hazard layers and geospatially sampling across various hazard probabilities. The way we used it was just basically we took these static inundation maps and used them as kind of scenarios to give us our different hazard exposure. So to try and look at what we might expect the impact to be over a farm as a whole, we came up with these impact states. So, obviously we can say that small sections of farms can be highly impacted, but if this is only a small section of farm, it's likely that, recovery will be, relatively rapid. So we came up with these percentages of the pasture that might be covered by this coastal inundation. And we also came up with a bit of a description about what we thought that might, on a practical level, mean. The other aspect was thinking about milking shed inundation. So for this, we did actually use the depth of the expected inundation, and this was related to where we thought that the water would start affecting the actual componentry within a shed and prevent milking. So this was the modelling pipeline. Sorry, it's not the most exciting figure ever. I probably should have, used some rainbow colours or something. But you can see that we have our extreme sea level data and our coastal inundation model at the top. So this is the bit that's covered in Ryan Paulick's excellent paper. And then this is the bit we did where we took these and we used our productive land exposure layer, and we also took our milking sheds, spatially sampled these, came up with a ratio within the farm that was exposed to the hazard, which then could be used and translated into overall impact state, and then what we expect the associated recovery actions to be. This was then aggregated we could aggregate at anything really, a farm level, region level, just whatever does it for you. I'm saying we did all this. Really, Riskcape did all this calculation, so it's something that we previously have used ArcGIS tools to do, and it's taken a long time. So it's really great to be able to rapidly run multiple scenarios through. So the results showed that, at current sea level rises, we have this quite vast difference between the number of farms that are impacted in a 10-year recurrence interval event versus a 500-year event. So you can see we have 472 at a 10-year and 867 at a 500-year. But by the time we're getting up to 2 meters of sea level rise, the difference between that frequently occurring event and that really, out of this world extreme event is really small, less than 100 farms different in terms of farms that are exceeding an impact state of 1, which is when we're starting to see some real problems where intervention's needed, the norm's not going to cut it. So we can see that even more frequent, traditionally less severe events will begin to affect a large number of farms. When we look at these results by the land use capability mapping, so what we're basically trying to do with this is think about, is it the good land that's getting affected, or is it the sort of marginal stuff that, maybe preferentially wouldn't be used intensively anyway? And we can see that particularly for the Waikato region, this is unfortunately, it is the most productive land that has been affected by this coastal inundation. So we would expect in these areas that they would be less of an ability to kind of move animals around, less adaptive capacity to cope without huge sacrifices in terms of productivity within farms. Looking at the dairy shed exposure, we see a similar pattern where the Waikato is the most exposed, perhaps not unexpectedly. we see that there's about $224 million worth of dairy sheds exposed to a 10-year recurrence interval event at 2 meters of sea level rise. So this only includes the replacement of the physical assets as well. The actual loss would be much, much greater due to the loss in production. And is my time nearly up, Nick? Anyway, last slide. So this is the kind of so what. So this is where we start to think about, so at these various impact states, what assistance would we think that farmers might need to get back on their feet, both in terms of external assistance, actions within the farm, and then also what might be needed in the longer term. So yeah, we see that our impacts can be much more severe with coastal inundation compared to fluvial or pluvial flooding, just because of that salinity influence. So yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Heather. So if I'd invite all of the presenters to turn their cameras on. There was a question Pierre put in the chat about which climate scenarios were used for those feed deficit graphs. And while you're having a think about that, for everyone else, you can either put a message into the chat, or if you want, raise your hand and we can take take questions that way as well. But Pierre.
We used the 4.5 as the middle of the road. We got 2.6, 4.5, 6, and 8.5. And then, as I showed, at least in Lower South Island, I showed optimistic and less optimistic. The one for the Piako Maramara was just the 4.5 optimistic. So those are the projections that we received from NIWA. So, I mean, obviously, we had to pick because we just can't show all the potential outcomes. So, yeah, that was what we showed, what I showed there.
Yeah. Heather, I mean, you talked about some $200 million worth of direct losses. Catherine, I was wondering the financial implications of facial eczema. Has that kind of been quantified, or is that still sort of an open question?
No, still probably an open question for both of them. So in Australia, it's something that they've done where they've actually tried to quantify the impact of disease, both through the cost of treatment or prevention and the lost production and death as a result of the disease. But it's definitely something in New Zealand that we don't currently have information on, aside from the talking to vets and farmers.
There's a question. Bill. Bill Guest, I see you've got your hand up.
Nick, just to come in and say, I'm not sure that people can actually unmute themselves. So it's best if they can put their questions in the Q&A chat. Yeah, there's a few in there already. I can see 4 there.
Excellent. So for Pierre, so did you look at event-based scenarios? So across the different RCPs, I mean, you did sort of talk about the different RCPs. So what we received from NIWA was for all 4 RCPs, but we selected to only present our results for 4.5 and 8.5, and we also received the data, the climate data for 6 GCMs, global circulation models. So we ran all 6, and then we took the averages, which means you lose out on extremes if they are captured in those GCMs, your individual GCMs, because if you average across years, you lose that kind of granularity of the data. So NIWA specifically told us they are not modeling extremes. They're not presenting the data to us so that we can present our results in terms of extremes. So meaning we are just going with gradual, slow climate change over the rest of this century. That's sort of what our results are based on, because we don't have individual years with extreme events. Thanks very much. And this is maybe a question for both Heather and Catherine. There was a question about regarding the sort of the multifaceted implications or the multiple stresses that places like the Waikato in particular is facing. And I know Whitiora is kind of looking at this. What are your recommended? Is it feasible to consider a change in land use to either reduce that exposure or to manage some of those potential disease implications? So I don't know if either of you would like to go first and take on that rather.
I think from a disease perspective, already, for example, we see decreasing sheep numbers in the far north, and part of that is as a result of diseases. But then there are non-chemical options as well. I mean, I'm a geneticist, and one of the things that we do is look to be able to breed animals that are more able to cope with disease challenges. And so that's definitely a consideration, as well as in the parasite space, there are ways that you can farm that will help minimise the impact of disease, and probably the same with facial eczema as well. So while it might not be complete land use change in all areas, it might be an adjustment to the way that the farms are farmed to cope with those increased risk and decreased tools.
Yeah, I mean,
answer.
I was going to say something similar, realistically, are we going to have wholesale land use change in the recent, and, potentially not. But I do think that we will start to see farmers kind of adjusting within their land parcels and across their communities in terms of how they farm, but also how they respond to events.
Yeah, maybe I can chip in there. We had several requests coming in from Hauraki farmers. Heather, I reckon your flood and farms that are exposed to that risk flood risk is specifically down there. And the farmers tell us the parcels of land they have currently using it as support blocks. They don't want to expand their dairy business onto those support blocks. They are asking us, what are the other land uses that we can bring into our business so that we can diversify our business instead of growing our dairy business? So that's what they're talking about.
Yeah, that sort of diversification and providing that buffering is something that we've talked about quite a bit in the project. Yeah. Heather, the sort of saltwater intrusion, both the sort of direct impacts on pasture and killing off pasture, but also, the sort of the changing occurrence and the dynamic nature of saltwater intrusion and how that's changing.
I didn't catch the first part of that. Sorry, did anyone else?
Oh, sorry.
You went out.
Yeah, sorry. The impact of saltwater intrusion on bore water as a result of sea level rise, and sort of whether you are able to comment on that.
No, not at the moment, but I do know that that's a huge component of the Future Coast Aotearoa project. So it is definitely something there's a lot of work on to answer that question, because I mean it's going to be coming at some parcels of land from both sides, in effect, from the surface and the groundwater. So yeah.
And Pierre, just a question about whether or not I think there is a paper in prep, but someone's asked about that. And Catherine, another question for you is about one of the assumptions that was that moisture was a limiting factor in your modeling. Was this included, and would that show a possibly a more optimistic result if that was incorporated into the model?
So we did talk with Dave Lethwick about this, it was his model, and I think it would provide from memory, what he said is that it would provide more information, but I don't think that it would provide an order of magnitude of more information. So while it would be useful, I think particularly in terms of how dry it got, that the main limiting factor for the development of those eggs is actually temperature. And there have been some models that have been published that do include rainfall as well, internationally, which we could look at. But in terms of that simple model, we know that temperature is the biggest driver of larval development. So yes, it would be interesting, but I don't think it would massively change, particularly when we consider how how variable the information going in terms of the climatic scenarios are.
And see, there's also some questions in the Q&A box. So I think probably Heather, you might know this, whether or not the inundation modeling included vertical land movement. I think that's part of the other NZC rise, isn't it? Including that vertical land movement component. So
yeah, I just answered that question in the chat. Okay. No, it didn't. But it would be really awesome to rerun. I mean, at the time we were setting this up, those maps weren't available. So yeah, it'd be great to set that up.
And again, Heather, a question about whether that sort of figure of LUC, whether that figures across all of New Zealand, that 80% figure.
Yeah, that's the national value. Yeah.
Excellent. And Pierre, question from Luke Harrington. Were you surprised by the negligible differences in UNI yield projections between RCPs 4.5 and 8.5? And are the seasonal growth and demand curves for an average year only?
Yeah, I was surprised, I must say, about the small differences between 4.5 and 8.5. You know, yeah, interesting. Sometimes we predicted that 8.5 would look better into the rest of this century for some situations. But I think that's just how, you know, the interactions between the different climate variables and how they drive our models. So yes, the first answer is surprise here and there. The second one was what I presented, the deficits. Just to repeat that second bit, Nick. Do you see it somewhere?
Oh, sorry, yeah. Yeah, the seasonal growth and demand curves, are they for an average year only?
Yeah, well, look, as I tried to explain there with the optimistic, that's the average, those are the average years. And then we say less optimistic, we regarded that as one standard deviation below the average. So because we had this whole family of curves and we had to pick the middle one, we said, let's take the middle as optimistic, one standard deviation below as less optimistic. But all those graphs for the lower South Island, I presented optimistic and less optimistic. For Matamata Piako, it was just a 4.5 optimistic. So yeah, that's what I presented. Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting to see the Catherine, your slides. I mean, that significant difference between those two. I mean, again, it's a high and a low, but it really did become quite noticeable. Whereas Pierre's, yeah, again, it was much more a sort of a muted effect. So. And then probably we've got time for this last question, and then hopefully we can follow up with some of the others. But regarding Pierre, in UNI, presumably C3 grasses will be outcompeted by kikuyu and other C4 grasses. And has this been considered? This is kind of an emissions question, but is this sort of incorporated in terms of looking ahead, potential sort of on-farm emissions and mitigation?
We are in another project. We are looking at the C4 grasses, not in this one. In fact, I've got to correct myself here, because one of our master students who looked at Dargaville specifically, kikuyu, which is C4 grass, was specifically part of her adaptation. How do we cope? How does kikuyu cope with these climate changes, and how will that look into the future? And it looked quite good. In fact, that kikuyu is just going to be like the lifesaver for those farmers if they can learn how to work with it and not against it. Whereas C4 grass was in. I cannot say how it affects greenhouse gases, whether that was part of the study, but definitely C4 versus C3 is,
And Catherine, this, I suppose this last question does, given this is related, do those sort of changing pasture composition, poor ryegrass persistence, will that ultimately sort of also affect sort of disease incidence?
Yes, I think it, from memory, it will have an impact. How much of an impact, I don't know off the top of my head, but for both as well. So with facial eczema, the fungus grows on the dead leaf matter at the base of the sword, and I'm pretty sure with parasites as well, there's been some research around the different pasture species with the ability of the larvae to migrate up as well. So yes, it will have an impact. How much, I can't say.
Excellent. Yeah, which I think is probably, you know, if we can take anything away from all three presentations, is in addition to the sort of the need to better understand these extremes, is the ways that the interactions between them, the compounding uncertainties, and all of the rest. So thank you again to our three presenters. Really appreciate that. Next week we'll be sort of continuing to move around that sort of adaptation knowledge cycle and looking a bit more closely at the decisions and actions necessary for adaptation. And with that, I'll pass back to Caitlin to round us out.
Kia ora. Thank you all so much to our speakers. I hope you found that useful and interesting. And yeah, I'm just going to close this out with a karakia and just reiterate that it'd be great to see you next Monday. I'll pop a link in the chat, or perhaps one of the other team can, for more information about next Monday's webinar on barriers and enablers to adaptation in the primary sector. Okay, me karakia tātou. Kia whakaria te tapu, kia wātia ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai, haumie, huie, taia ki e. Thank you and have a great rest of your afternoon.